They told me grief makes you see things that are not there. They told me I was imagining him because I could not let go. I believed them at first. I wanted to believe them. Because if I was not imagining the footsteps in the hallway at midnight, if I was not imagining the cold draft that moved through locked rooms, if I was not imagining the feeling of being watched as I sat alone by the fire, then something far more terrible was true. That Edmund had not left me at all. That he was still here, in this house, somewhere between the living and the dead, and I was the only one who could feel him. It was October when I arrived at Ashford Manor, 6 weeks after they buried him. The house stood on a windswept hill in Derbyshire, grey stone against grey sky, surrounded by ancient oaks that had long since lost their leaves. The carriage ride from the station had been silent except for the rattle of wheels on gravel and the occasional cry of crows circling above. I had not wanted to come. I had wanted to disappear into the anonymity of London, to forget everything that had happened, to let the scandal fade and rebuild my life somewhere far from the memory of Edmund Ashford and the ruin he had left behind. But his mother had written to me in a hand that trembled across the page, begging me to come, and I had not been able to refuse her. She had lost her son. I had lost the man I was to marry. We were bound by grief, whether I wanted to be or not. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hallowell, met me at the door. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She looked at me the way everyone in Edmund's world had looked at me since his death, as though I were something unfortunate that had wandered in from the cold and could not be turned away out of mere decency. She said very little as she led me through the entrance hall, past portraits of stern-faced men and pale women in high collars, up a staircase that creaked beneath our feet. The house smelled of beeswax and damp wool, and something else I could not name, something faintly sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. My room was in the east wing, a corner chamber with tall windows that overlooked the garden and the woods beyond. It was larger than any room I had ever slept in, furnished with a 4-poster bed draped in heavy velvet, a writing desk, a wardrobe of dark mahogany, and a mirror that stood nearly as tall as I did, framed in tarnished silver. Mrs. Hallowell informed me that Lady Ashford would receive me at tea, that dinner was served at 8, that the house retired early, and I was not to wander the corridors after the lamps were extinguished. She said this last part with a particular emphasis, her pale eyes lingering on my face as though she expected me to disobey. Then she left, and I was alone. I stood at the window and looked out at the garden. It had been elegant once, I could see that. There were stone paths and hedges trimmed into geometric shapes, a fountain in the center that no longer ran, benches placed at intervals beneath the trees. But everything had gone wild. The hedges were overgrown, the paths choked with weeds, the fountain green with moss. It looked like a place that had been abandoned, forgotten, left to the mercy of time and weather. I thought of Edmund, who had loved this house, who had spoken of it with a kind of reverence I had never fully understood. He had wanted to bring me here. He had wanted to show me the library where he had spent his childhood, the conservatory where his mother grew orchids, the chapel where generations of Ashfords had been christened and married and mourned. He had spoken of our future here as though it were something already written, something inevitable. And now he was gone, and I was here alone, a guest in the house that should have been mine. I unpacked my few belongings and tried not to think about the last time I had seen him. It had been in London, in the drawing room of my aunt's house, 3 days before he died. He had been restless that evening, pacing by the window, running his hands through his dark hair in a way that made him look younger than his 30 years. He had told me he needed to return to Ashford Manor, that there were things he needed to attend to, matters he could not explain but that weighed on him heavily. I had asked him what was wrong, but he had only kissed my forehead and told me not to worry, that he would write to me as soon as he could, that everything would be well. He had lied. 3 days later, he was found in the library with a bullet in his chest and his father's dueling pistol in his hand. The coroner had ruled it a suicide. No one had been able to say why. I did not believe it. I could not believe it. Edmund had been many things, proud, secretive, sometimes distant, but he had not been a man who would take his own life. He had been planning our wedding. He had been making arrangements for us to travel to Italy in the spring. He had been full of plans, full of a future he wanted us to share. And yet everyone I spoke to, his friends, his solicitor, even my own family, had quietly suggested that perhaps I had not known him as well as I thought I did, that perhaps there had been things he kept hidden, burdens he carried alone, that perhaps the engagement had been a mistake, a desperate attempt to anchor himself to something stable before the darkness pulled him under. They spoke of him as though he had been fragile, troubled, a man on the edge of collapse. I hated them for it. I hated the way they pitied me, the way they whispered behind their hands, the way they looked at me as though I were a fool who had been deceived. Tea with Lady Ashford was a quiet, somber affair. She received me in the drawing room, a vast space hung with tapestries and furnished with chairs that looked as though no one had sat in them for decades. She was smaller than I had imagined, a delicate woman with silver hair and Edmund's dark eyes, dressed in deep mourning black that made her skin look almost translucent. She took my hands when I entered and held them for a long moment without speaking, and I saw in her face the same grief that lived in my own heart. We sat together by the fire and drank tea from porcelain cups so thin I was afraid they would shatter in my hands. She asked me about the journey, about my aunt, about whether my room was comfortable. She did not ask me about Edmund. Neither of us mentioned his name. It sat between us like a weight, heavy and unspoken, filling the silence with everything we could not say. After tea, I returned to my room and tried to rest, but sleep would not come. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, the creak of old wood, the rattle of window panes in the wind. Somewhere below, a clock chimed the hour. I counted the strikes. 7. The light outside was fading, the sky turning the color of ash. I thought about lighting a candle, but I did not move. I felt paralyzed, trapped in a kind of liminal space between waking and dreaming, between past and present. I thought about Edmund. I thought about the last time I had touched him, the warmth of his hand in mine, the way he had looked at me as though I were something precious he was afraid of losing. I thought about the cold weight of the earth they had piled on top of him, and I felt something inside me break open, a grief so vast and shapeless I did not know how to contain it. That was when I heard the footsteps. They came from the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate, the sound of a man's boots on a wooden floor. I sat up, my heart suddenly pounding. I thought perhaps it was a servant, or Lady Ashford's steward, someone making their rounds before dinner. But the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I stared at the door, waiting for a knock, waiting for it to open. Nothing happened. The silence stretched on, thick and expectant. I rose from the bed and crossed the room, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. I stepped out and looked in both directions. The corridor stretched away into shadow, lit only by the faint glow of daylight filtering through a window at the far end. There was no one there. No servant, no steward, no one at all. I stood very still and listened, but I heard nothing except the wind outside and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself it was the old house settling, the sound of my own heartbeat magnified by silence. I went back inside and closed the door, but I knew what I had heard, and I knew that I was not imagining it. Dinner was a formal, uncomfortable meal. Lady Ashford sat at one end of the long table, and I sat at the other, separated by what felt like miles of polished wood and candlelight. We were served by silent footmen who moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing without sound. The food was rich and flavorless, roast beef and potatoes and greens that I could barely taste. Lady Ashford spoke very little, and when she did, it was to comment on the weather or the condition of the roads or some small matter of household management. I answered politely, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about the footsteps, about the empty hallway, about the strange feeling I had of being watched. I glanced at the shadows in the corners of the room and wondered if Edmund's ghost might be standing there, silent and unseen, watching me eat at his mother's table. After dinner, Lady Ashford retired to her rooms, and I was left alone. Mrs. Hallowell appeared to escort me back to my chamber, and I followed her through the dim corridors, past closed doors and silent rooms. She left me at my door with a curt good night, and I went inside and locked the door behind me. The fire had been lit while I was at dinner, and the room was warm, almost stifling. I opened one of the windows to let in the cold night air and stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The garden below was dark, the trees skeletal against the sky. I thought I saw movement near the fountain, a flicker of white among the shadows, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I prepared for bed and climbed beneath the heavy quilts, but I could not sleep. The house was full of sounds I did not recognize, creaks and sighs and distant murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I lay in the dark and listened, my body tense, my mind racing. I thought about Edmund, about the way he had died, about the questions that had never been answered. I thought about the whispers I had heard in London, the rumors that had circulated after his death, that he had been involved in something dangerous, something occult, that he had attended seances and consulted mediums, that he had been obsessed with the idea of contacting the dead. I had dismissed it all as gossip, the cruel speculation of people who had nothing better to do than tear apart the reputation of a man who could no longer defend himself. But now, lying alone in his childhood home, I wondered if there had been truth in it, if Edmund had been searching for something, chasing something, and if that search had led him to his death. I do not know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke, the room was freezing. The fire had gone out, and the window I had opened was now closed. I sat up, confused, my breath misting in the air. I was certain I had left the window open. I looked around the room, but nothing else seemed disturbed. The door was still locked. I was alone. I pulled the quilts around me and tried to warm myself, but the cold seemed to come from inside me, from some deep place that no amount of blankets could reach. That was when I saw the mirror. It stood across the room, tall and silver, catching the faint light from the window. And there, written in the condensation that had formed on its surface, were 5 letters. Edmund. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was impossible. I told myself I was still asleep, still dreaming. But I could feel the cold air on my skin, the rough texture of the quilt beneath my hands. I was awake. This was real. I climbed out of bed and crossed the room slowly, as though the mirror might vanish if I moved too quickly. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold and wet, and beneath my fingertips, the letters blurred and ran like tears. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where his name had been, and I felt something shift inside me. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something that felt almost like hope. Because if Edmund was here, if some part of him had remained in this house, then perhaps I had not lost him after all. Perhaps he was trying to tell me something. Perhaps he needed me. I wiped the mirror clean with the sleeve of my nightgown and returned to bed. But I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the dark and waited for the dawn, and when the first pale light finally crept through the window, I made a decision. I would not leave Ashford Manor. I would not run from whatever was happening here. I would stay, and I would find out the truth. I would find out what had happened to Edmund, and why his spirit could not rest, and if he was truly reaching out to me from beyond the grave, I would answer him, even if it meant crossing into the darkness myself. I did not tell Lady Ashford about the mirror. I did not tell anyone. What could I say that would not make them look at me with pity or concern, that would not confirm what they already believed, that grief had unraveled my mind and turned me into someone who saw messages from the dead? I kept silent and watched, and I began to notice things I had missed before. The house was full of closed doors, rooms that were never opened, wings that were never visited, spaces that existed in shadow and silence. When I asked Mrs. Hallowell about them, she told me they had been shut up after Edmund's father died, that Lady Ashford could not bear to look at them, that it was better to let the past rest undisturbed. But I wondered what was hidden behind those locked doors, what secrets the Ashford family had decided were safer buried than revealed. On my 3rd morning at the manor, I woke early and decided to explore. The house was still quiet, the servants not yet moving through the corridors. I dressed quickly and slipped out of my room, carrying a single candle to light my way. The hallways were cold and dim, the portraits on the walls watching me with disapproving eyes. I walked slowly, listening for any sound, any sign that I was not alone. But there was nothing except the whisper of my own footsteps and the faint creak of floorboards beneath my weight. I found the library on the second floor, at the end of a long corridor lined with windows that looked out over the gardens. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. The room was vast, 2 stories high, with shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling and a narrow gallery that ran along the upper level. There were thousands of books, leather-bound volumes in shades of green and burgundy and black, their spines embossed with gold lettering that caught the candlelight. A massive desk stood near the window, its surface covered with papers and ink bottles, and a lamp that had burned down to nothing. This was where Edmund had died. This was where they had found him. I set the candle on the desk and looked around slowly, trying to imagine what had happened here. The official story was that he had been alone, that he had locked the door from the inside, that no one had heard the shot. They said he had left no note, no explanation, nothing to tell us why. But as I stood in that room, I felt the wrongness of it. Edmund had loved this library. He had told me it was his sanctuary, the place where he felt most at peace. It did not make sense that he would choose to end his life here, in the one place that had brought him joy. I began to search the desk, carefully lifting papers and looking through drawers. Most of it was mundane, correspondence with his solicitor, bills from tradesmen, invitations to social events he would never attend. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of unopened letters, I found something else, a journal, bound in black leather, with no name or marking on the cover. I opened it and saw Edmund's handwriting, angular and precise, filling page after page. My hands trembled as I turned to the first entry. It was dated nearly a year before his death, and it began simply. I attended a gathering at Lord Pembridge's house tonight. Miss Hartley was there, the medium everyone has been speaking of. She conducted a séance, and I confess I went into it with complete skepticism. But what I witnessed has shaken me to my core. She spoke in voices that were not her own. She knew things about my father, things no living person could have known. I do not know what to make of it. I do not know if I believe in spirits, in the possibility that the dead can reach across the veil and speak to us, but I cannot deny what I saw. I cannot pretend it did not happen. I read on, turning page after page, and with each entry the picture became clearer. Edmund had not simply attended one séance, he had become obsessed. He had sought out mediums all over London, attending circles in private drawing rooms and rented halls, chasing the possibility that death was not an ending, but a doorway. He wrote about his father, about the guilt he carried for their last conversation, about the things he wished he had said and never would. He wrote about his fear that the dead were watching, waiting, trying to communicate with the living, but unable to break through. And he wrote about a society, a group of men and women who believed that science and spiritualism were not opposites, but 2 paths to the same truth, that it was possible to bridge the gap between this world and the next, if one only had the knowledge and the courage to try. I felt a chill run through me as I read the final entries, written just days before his death. He had been planning something. He had written about a ritual, a method of opening a door that should remain closed. He had written that he was close, that he had found the key, that soon he would have proof that the dead could return. And then the journal stopped. The last page was blank, except for a single line, written in a hand that looked unsteady, as though he had been shaking when he wrote it. If you are reading this, I have failed. Do not follow me. I sat there in the cold morning light, the journal open in my lap, and I felt something close to terror. Edmund had not taken his own life out of despair or madness. He had done something, attempted something, and it had gone horribly wrong. And now he was trying to reach me, trying to tell me what had happened, because he could not rest until someone knew the truth. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, and I quickly closed the journal and slipped it into the pocket of my dress. The door opened, and Mrs. Hallowell appeared, her face pinched with disapproval. She informed me that breakfast was being served, that Lady Ashford was expecting me, that I should not be wandering the house unattended. I apologized and followed her downstairs, but my mind was racing. I needed to know more. I needed to find out who these people were, this society Edmund had written about. I needed to understand what he had done and why it had cost him his life. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Lady Ashford seemed more fragile than she had the day before, her hands shaking as she lifted her teacup. I wanted to ask her about Edmund, about his interest in spiritualism, about whether she had known what he was doing, but I could not find the words. She looked so breakable, so lost in her grief, that I could not bear to add to her suffering, so I said nothing, and we ate in silence, and afterward I excused myself and returned to my room. I spent the afternoon reading through the journal again, making notes, trying to piece together the fragments of information Edmund had left behind. He had mentioned names, places, dates. He had written about a man named Dr. Cornelius Thorne, a physician and researcher who believed that consciousness survived death and could be measured, studied, perhaps even communicated with through scientific means. He had written about a woman named Madame Laveau, a medium who claimed to have contacted the spirits of the dead and brought back messages from the other side. And he had written about Ashford Manor itself, about the history of the house, about rumors that it had always been a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. As evening fell, I lit the lamps in my room and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I thought about Edmund, about the man I had loved and the man I had not fully known. I thought about the risks he had taken, the boundaries he had crossed, the desperation that must have driven him to seek answers in such dangerous places. And I thought about the warning he had left in his journal. Do not follow me. But how could I not? He was reaching out to me from beyond death itself. He had written his name in the mirror. He had walked the hallways of this house. He was trapped here, caught between worlds, and I was the only one who could hear him. That night, I did not wait for sleep. I sat by the window and watched the darkness deepen over the garden, and I waited for him to come. I did not have to wait long. Just after midnight, I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving along the corridor outside my room. This time, I did not hesitate. I rose and opened the door. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight through the windows, but I could see him, a figure at the far end of the corridor, standing in shadow, watching me. He was tall and slender, dressed in dark clothes, and even though I could not see his face clearly, I knew it was Edmund. I felt it in my bones, in the way my heart recognized him, even when my eyes could not. I took a step forward, and he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I followed, my bare feet silent on the cold floor, my breath coming fast. He led me through the house, down corridors I had never seen, past rooms I did not recognize, deeper and deeper into the west wing where Mrs. Hallowell had told me never to go. And then he stopped in front of a door at the end of a narrow hallway. I reached out and tried the handle. It was locked. I stood there, staring at the door, and I felt the presence beside me, cold and watchful. I whispered his name into the darkness. Edmund, if you are here, if you can hear me, help me understand. Show me what you need me to see. The cold air around me seemed to shift, to move, and I heard a sound like a breath, like a whisper. And then, from somewhere deep inside the locked room, I heard it. A single word, spoken in a voice I would have known anywhere. Clara. I pressed my hand against the door and closed my eyes, and I knew that whatever lay beyond it held the answer to everything. I could not open the door that night. I tried, pulling at the handle until my hands ached, but it would not give. The presence that had been beside me faded, and I was left alone in the cold hallway with nothing but the echo of my own name still ringing in my ears. I returned to my room as dawn broke, exhausted and shaken, and fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of Edmund reaching for me across an impossible distance. When I woke, I knew what I had to do. I needed the key to that room, and the only person who would have it was Lady Ashford. I dressed carefully and went downstairs to find her. She was in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed room at the back of the house, where pale winter light filtered through the windows and fell across rows of orchids that had long since stopped blooming. She sat in a wicker chair with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. I approached her gently and asked if we might speak. She looked at me with those dark eyes, so like Edmund's, and I saw a flicker of something I had not expected. Recognition, as though she had been waiting for me to come to her, as though she knew what I was going to ask. I told her I had been in the library. I told her I had found Edmund's journal, that I had read about his interest in spiritualism, about the society he had joined, about the experiments he had been conducting. I told her that I believed his death was not what it appeared to be, that there were questions that needed answers. I did not tell her about the footsteps, or the mirror, or the voice that had spoken my name. I did not tell her I had seen her son's ghost walking the hallways of his childhood home. But I think she knew. I think she had always known. She was silent for a long time, her fingers twisting the black silk of her mourning dress. Then she spoke, and her voice was so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. She told me that Edmund had changed in the months before his death, that he had become secretive, obsessed, spending long hours alone in the library, or disappearing to London for days at a time without explanation. She told me she had tried to talk to him, to understand what was troubling him, but he had shut her out. And then one morning he had asked her for something, the key to the West Wing, to the room that had belonged to his father. She had refused. That room had been locked since her husband's death 5 years earlier, and she had wanted it to stay that way. Too many painful memories, too much grief contained in that space. But Edmund had insisted. He had told her he needed to go through his father's papers, that there were things he needed to understand. She had given him the key because she could not bear to refuse him anything. And 3 days later, he was dead. She looked at me with tears running down her pale cheeks, and she asked me the question I had been asking myself since the moment I arrived at Ashford Manor. Do you think he is still here? Do you think he cannot leave? I took her hand and told her the truth. I told her that I believed Edmund was trapped, that something he had done had bound him to this place, and that the only way to free him was to understand what had happened in that locked room. She nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something she had been too afraid to admit to herself. Then she reached into her pocket and drew out a small iron key, tarnished with age and disuse. She placed it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. "Find him," she whispered. "Help him rest." I left her there among the dying orchids and climbed the stairs to the West Wing, the key heavy in my palm. The corridor was exactly as it had been the night before, narrow and cold, the door at the end waiting like a mouth. I fitted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism resisted at first, then gave with a soft click. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a study, smaller than the library, but just as full of books. A desk stood by the window, covered in papers and strange instruments I did not recognize. Glass tubes and copper wires, scales and measuring devices, diagrams of the human brain pinned to the walls. This had been the domain of Edmund's father, a man I had never met, but whose presence still filled the space like a lingering perfume. And it had become Edmund's domain, too, in those final weeks of his life. I moved through the room slowly, touching the spines of books, reading the titles. Treatises on consciousness and the soul, studies of electromagnetism and vital energy, accounts of seances and spirit communication written by men who claimed to be scientists. And tucked into the corner of the desk, a stack of letters tied with black ribbon. I untied them and began to read. They were correspondence between Edmund and Dr. Cornelius Thorne, the physician he had mentioned in his journal. The letters were formal at first, polite exchanges about research and theory. But as they progressed, they became more urgent, more intimate. Thorne wrote about his experiments, about his belief that the soul was a form of energy that could be measured and manipulated, that it did not simply vanish at death but transformed into something else. He wrote about cases where dying patients had reported seeing loved ones who had passed before them, about moments when the boundary between life and death seemed to blur. And he wrote about a device he had constructed, a machine that he believed could detect the presence of spirits and perhaps even allow communication with them. Edmund had been fascinated. In his replies, he wrote about his father, about the unfinished business between them, about his desperate need to know if his father's spirit still existed somewhere. Thorne had invited him to London to see the device for himself, and Edmund had gone. And after that visit, everything had changed. The final letter in the stack was from Thorne, written just 2 days before Edmund's death. It was brief and cryptic. "I am sorry, my friend. I warned you that the door, once opened, cannot easily be closed. You have made contact, but you must understand that not all spirits are what they claim to be. Some are lost, some are malevolent, and some are trapped between worlds, unable to move forward, feeding on the living to sustain themselves. If you have experienced what I fear you have, you must sever the connection immediately. Do not attempt the ritual again. I will come to you as soon as I am able, but in the meantime, I beg you, protect yourself. Burn the sigils, destroy the tools, walk away before it is too late. I set the letter down with trembling hands and looked around the room again, and this time I saw what I had missed before. Marks on the floor, faint lines drawn in chalk or charcoal, forming a circle with symbols I did not understand. Candles burned down to stubs placed at intervals around the perimeter, and in the center of the circle, a dark stain on the wooden floor that might have been ink or oil or something else entirely. Edmund had performed the ritual here. He had opened the door Thorn had warned him about, and something had come through. I felt the temperature in the room drop, felt the air grow thick and heavy. I turned slowly, and I saw him standing in the doorway. Edmund. But this time he was clearer, more solid, and I could see his face. He looked exactly as I remembered, dark hair, pale skin, the sharp line of his jaw, the eyes that had always seemed to see more than they should. But there was something wrong. His expression was anguished, his mouth open as though he were trying to speak, but could not. And behind him, in the shadowed hallway, I saw something else, a darkness that moved and shifted, a presence that felt hungry and cold. I understood then. Edmund had not simply contacted his father's spirit. He had opened a door to something far worse, something that had followed him back from the other side. And when he realized what he had done, when he saw the danger he had brought into his home, he had tried to close the door the only way he knew how, by ending his own life and binding his spirit to this place, standing guard, keeping the darkness from spreading. But it had not worked. The door was still open. The darkness was still here, and Edmund was caught in between, unable to move on, unable to rest, forced to watch as the thing he had unleashed waited for its chance to break free. I crossed the room to him, reaching out even though I knew I could not touch him. I spoke to him in a voice that shook with emotion. I understand now. I know what you did, but you do not have to carry this alone anymore. Tell me how to close the door. Tell me how to free you. His lips moved, and I heard his voice, faint and distant, as though it were coming from very far away. The book, my father's book, the red leather volume in the library. It holds the answer. But Clara, you must be careful. It will try to stop you. It knows you are here. It knows you want to send it back. I felt the cold intensify, felt the presence behind him grow stronger, angrier. I did not wait. I ran from the room, down the corridor, through the house, the sound of something following me echoing in my ears. I reached the library and slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I began to search for the red leather book that might save us both. The library shelves towered above me, thousands of books in every shade of leather, and I had no idea where to begin. I moved along the rows, running my fingers over the spines, searching for anything bound in red. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold presence pressing against the door behind me, testing it, looking for a way in. I had locked it, but I did not know how long that would hold. I found it on the third shelf from the top, tucked between two thick volumes on natural philosophy. A slender book bound in dark red leather, its cover worn smooth with age. There was no title stamped on the spine, no marking to indicate what it contained. I pulled it down and opened it carefully, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a grimoire, a book of ritual magic written in a careful hand that might have belonged to Edmund's father or someone even older. The pages were filled with diagrams and instructions, methods for summoning spirits, for binding them, for opening pathways between the living world and the realm of the dead. And near the end, I found what I was looking for, a ritual for closing a door that had been opened, for sending back what should not have been allowed through, for severing the connection between worlds. But there was a price. There was always a price. The ritual required a willing sacrifice, not of life, but of memory. Someone living had to offer up their connection to the spirit that was trapped, had to sever every bond of love and remembrance, had to forget completely that the person had ever existed. Only then would the door close. Only then would the trapped spirit be free to move on, and the darkness be sent back to where it belonged. I read the words again and again, hoping I had misunderstood, hoping there was another way, but there was not. If I wanted to free Edmund, if I wanted to stop the malevolent thing he had unleashed, I would have to give him up entirely. I would have to erase him from my heart and mind, to let go of every memory we had shared, every word he had spoken to me, every moment of love and hope and promise. I would forget the way he smiled, the sound of his voice, the feeling of his hand in mine. I would forget that I had ever loved him at all. I sank into the chair by the desk and held the book in my lap, and I felt something inside me break. How could I do this? How could I choose to lose him twice, first to death and then to oblivion? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. Because he was suffering, because he was trapped in a liminal space, unable to rest, unable to move forward, bound by his own guilt and sacrifice to stand guard over a danger he had created. And because I loved him enough to let him go, even if it meant tearing out the part of my heart where he lived. I heard a sound at the door, a low scraping like claws on wood, and I knew I was running out of time. I gathered what I needed. Candles from the desk drawer, matches, a piece of chalk to draw the symbols the book described. I cleared a space on the floor in the center of the library and began to mark out the circle, copying the diagrams from the grimoire as carefully as I could. My hands were steady now, my mind clear. I had made my choice, and I would see it through. When the circle was complete, I placed the candles at the 4 cardinal points and lit them one by one. The flames cast long shadows across the room, and the air grew heavy with expectation. I stood in the center and opened the book, reading the words aloud in a voice that did not sound like my own. They were in Latin, phrases I did not fully understand but spoke anyway, trusting that they would do what they were meant to do. The temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath misting in the candlelight. The door rattled in its frame, and I heard a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, though the windows were all closed. And then Edmund appeared before me, standing just outside the circle, his form more solid than I had ever seen it. He looked at me with an expression of such sorrow and gratitude that I nearly stopped, nearly abandoned the ritual, and reached for him instead. But I did not stop. I continued reading, my voice rising above the wind, above the sound of the darkness pounding against the door, demanding to be let in. I spoke the words of severance, the phrases that would cut the threads binding Edmund to this world. And as I spoke, I felt them breaking inside me, one by one. The memory of the first time I met him at a dinner party in London, the way he had looked at me across the table as though I were the only person in the room. The memory of our first dance, his hand at my waist, his voice low in my ear telling me I was beautiful. The memory of the day he asked me to marry him, the way his hands had trembled as he slipped the ring onto my finger. Each memory dissolved like mist, and with it went the emotions attached to it, the love and joy and hope. I felt myself becoming hollow, emptied of everything that had made the past year of my life meaningful. And still I kept reading, because I had promised him, because this was the only way to set him free. Edmund watched me with tears running down his translucent face, and he mouthed words I could no longer hear. I love you. Thank you. Forgive me. And then, as I spoke the final phrase of the ritual, he began to fade. The darkness behind the door let out a sound like a scream, and I felt it being pulled away, dragged back through the doorway Edmund had opened, back to the place it belonged. The candles flared bright and then went out, plunging the room into blackness. When the light returned, he was gone. The oppressive cold was gone. The sense of being watched, of something hungry waiting in the shadows, was gone. The library was just a room again, filled with books and silence and the faint smell of candle smoke. I stood in the center of the circle and felt nothing. No grief, no relief, no sense of loss. I looked at the journal still lying on the desk, at the letters scattered across the floor, and I felt only a distant curiosity, as though they belonged to someone else's story. I knew, somewhere deep in the part of me that still remembered how to think, that something important had happened here, that I had lost something precious, but I could not recall what it was. I left the library and walked through the quiet house, and when I passed Lady Ashford in the hallway, she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked if I was well. I told her I was, though I was not certain it was true. I felt as though I were walking through a dream, as though the world around me were made of gauze and shadow. That night, I packed my belongings. I did not know why I had come to Ashford Manor or what I had been looking for, but I knew with a strange certainty that it was time to leave. Lady Ashford did not try to stop me. She only held my hand for a long moment before I climbed into the carriage, and she whispered something I did not quite hear, something that sounded like, "Thank you." As the carriage pulled away, I looked back at the house one last time. It stood gray and silent against the November sky, and I felt nothing when I looked at it. No fear, no sadness, no sense of anything left unfinished. I turned away and watched the road ahead, and I told myself that whatever had brought me here no longer mattered. I was free now, free to begin again, to build a life unburdened by the past. But sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, I felt an ache in my chest that had no name, a sense of something missing, something lost. And in those moments, I would reach for a memory that was not there, and I would whisper a name I could not quite remember into the darkness. Edmund. 3 months passed before I understood what I had lost. 3 months of living in London with my aunt, of taking up needlework and attending quiet teas, of existing in a world that felt strangely muted, as though I were watching life through a veil. People asked me about my time at Ashford Manor, and I told them it had been uneventful, restful, exactly what I had needed. I did not mention the gaps in my memory, the way certain dates seemed to have vanished from my mind, the feeling that something important had happened to me that I could no longer recall. My aunt worried that I had fallen into melancholy. She suggested I needed distraction, purpose, something to look forward to. She arranged for me to help at a charity school for girls in Whitechapel, teaching reading and arithmetic to children whose faces were thin with hunger and whose eyes held more knowledge of the world's cruelty than mine ever would. I threw myself into the work, grateful for something to fill the hollow space inside me. It was there, in that cramped schoolroom with its smell of chalk and damp wool, that I met Dr. Cornelius Thorne. He had come to examine one of the students who had taken ill, and I happened to be in the room when he arrived. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, carrying a worn medical bag and moving with the careful gentleness of someone who had seen much suffering. When he looked at me, I saw something flicker across his face, recognition, surprise, and then something that looked like profound sadness. After he had finished with the child, he asked if he might speak with me privately. We stood in the narrow hallway, and he studied my face for a long moment before speaking. He asked if I remembered him. I told him I did not, though something in his presence felt familiar in a way I could not name. He nodded slowly, as though this was the answer he had expected. He told me he had known someone once, a young man who had been like a son to him. A brilliant, troubled soul who had become obsessed with crossing the boundaries between life and death. He told me this young man had fallen in love, that he had spoken of his beloved with a tenderness that had given Thorne hope that perhaps love would anchor him, would keep him from venturing too far into darkness. But it had not been enough. The young man had gone too far, had opened doors that should have remained closed, and he had paid the price for it. And the woman he loved, Thorne said quietly, had paid a price as well. I felt something stir inside me, a fragment of feeling I could not quite grasp. I asked him who this young man was, why he was telling me this. He reached into his coat and drew out a small photograph in a silver frame. He held it out to me, and I took it with trembling hands. It was a portrait of a man I did not recognize, dark-haired, pale, with eyes that seemed to look through the camera and into something beyond. He was handsome in a way that made my heart ache, though I could not say why. And beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, was a young woman in a white dress. It took me a moment to realize the woman was me. I stared at the photograph, and I felt tears running down my face, though I did not understand why I was crying. I could not remember this man. I could not remember when this photograph had been taken, or why I had been standing beside him with such a look of happiness on my face. But something in me knew him, something deeper than memory, something written into the fabric of my soul, recognized him and mourned him. Thorne told me the young man's name was Edmund Ashford, that we had been engaged to be married, that he had died 3 months ago under circumstances that were never fully explained, and that I had gone to Ashford Manor and done something there, something brave and terrible, that had cost me every memory of him. He said he had received a letter from Lady Ashford shortly after I left, thanking him for his correspondence with her son and informing him that Edmund was at peace now, that the house was quiet for the first time in months, that whatever darkness had lingered there was gone. She had mentioned me in the letter, had said I had helped Edmund in ways she could not fully explain, and she had asked Thorne to watch over me if he ever had the chance, to make sure I was well. I listened to all of this, and I felt as though I were hearing a story about someone else, someone I had once been, but was no longer. And yet the ache in my chest grew stronger. The sense of something missing became almost unbearable. I asked Thorne why he was telling me this now, why he had sought me out. "Because you have the right to know," he said. "Because even if you cannot remember loving him, you did love him, and he loved you. And that love was real and true, even if it only exists now in the memories of others." He left me then, pressing the photograph into my hands and telling me I could keep it. I stood in that hallway for a long time, staring at the image of the man I could not remember and the version of myself I no longer knew. And slowly, carefully, I let myself feel the grief I had been holding at bay, not for the memories I had lost, because I could not mourn what I did not remember, but for the love itself, for the connection that had been severed, for the sacrifice that had been made. I understood now why I had felt so hollow, so adrift. I had given up the most precious thing I had, the deepest love I had ever known, to save the man who held it. And he was free now, free to rest, free to move beyond the pain and guilt that had trapped him. I would never know him again, never remember the sound of his voice or the touch of his hand. But he was at peace, and that was enough. I returned to my room that evening and placed the photograph on my bedside table. I looked at it before I slept, studying the faces of 2 people whose story I would never fully know, and I made myself a promise. I would live well. I would find purpose and meaning in my life. I would honor the sacrifice that had been made by building something good from what remained. The months that followed were not easy, but they were bearable. I continued teaching at the school, and I found that I had a gift for it, a patience and understanding that the children responded to. I made friends, tentative at first, then deeper connections with women who had also known loss and hardship. I learned to find joy in small things, in the way sunlight fell through a window, in the laughter of children, in a book read by the fire on a winter evening. And sometimes when I was alone in the quiet hours before dawn, I would feel a presence near me. Nothing frightening, nothing cold, just a sense of being watched over, of being loved by someone I could not see. I did not know if it was real or simply my imagination, a phantom conjured by the part of me that still longed for what I had lost. But I chose to believe it was real. I chose to believe that somewhere beyond the veil between worlds, Edmund Ashford was at peace, and that some part of him still kept watch over me, grateful for what I had done. 1 year after I left Ashford Manor, I received a letter from Lady Ashford. She wrote that she was leaving England, traveling to Italy where the light was warm and the past felt less heavy. She thanked me again for what I had done, though she did not specify what that was. And she told me that she had seen her son in a dream, that he had appeared to her young and whole and happy, and he had told her not to grieve anymore, that he was well, that he was where he needed to be. She hoped I was well too. She hoped I had found peace. I wrote back and told her I had, and it was true. I had found a kind of peace, a quiet acceptance of the shape my life had taken. I would never marry. I knew that now. I would never love again the way I had loved the man in the photograph, though I could not remember loving him at all. But I would have a life that mattered, a life that helped others, a life that honored the sacrifice that had been made. On the anniversary of Edmund's death, I went to a small church near the school and lit a candle. I did not pray, because I did not know what to pray for. But I sat in the silence, and I thought about love, about the way it could transcend memory and reason, about the way it could ask for everything and still be worth the cost. And I whispered into the quiet, to the man I could not remember and the spirit I could not see, 3 words that felt true even though I did not understand why. I forgive you. The candle flame flickered, and for just a moment I felt a warmth surround me like an embrace, and then it was gone, and I was alone again. But it was enough. It was more than enough. I rose and walked out into the London morning, into a world that was full of possibility and pain and all the complicated beauty of being alive. I did not know what the future held, but I knew I would face it with courage, because I had loved once, even if I could not remember it. And that love had been strong enough to break the chains of death itself. That was the legacy Edmund had left me. Not memories, but strength. Not the past, but the future. And as I walked through the streets where carriages rattled and vendors called and life surged forward in all its messy glory, I carried that legacy with me like a light. And somewhere I hoped he was finally free.